Most Britons, most Europeans, they see the news, there's a terrorist attack here, there's something happens in Paris, something happens in Brussels. But the political class and even most European citizens do not even look at it in big picture terms.
It's strange in Europe these days, the way in which we get caught up on these, something happens, something blows up, and then a few hours, we go back to the usual routine. The next day, sort of, within a week, before the funerals are over, everyone's sort of moved on.
Right.
And I thought this needed to try to be explained.
Yeah. And as you say, it's at a certain level, it's about us. So that even though Islam makes it into the subtitle of your book, it's not primarily about terrorism or even about Islam. Something deeper is going on in Europe, of which Islam and terrorism are really just symptoms.
Yes, I mean, it's something you've said for a long time, that as it were, this just happens to be the opportunistic thing that's most serious that's going on at the moment, but it sort of could have been anything in a way, anything that was assertive and believed in itself. I say in the book there are this sort of set of what I think of as thought diseases that we have. Guilt being one. Existential tiredness, which I explain at one point, is another. That sense that, you see, when trying to look at why politicians and others would totally change the society that they ought to be looking after.
Right.
It can't only be accident.
No.
And it's certainly not conspiracy, because nobody could have arranged this so well.
Right.
And I thought it's in part this feeling that we run out, that the stories run out, that as I say at one point, a change is as good as the rest. Right.
Which is, and people do actually believe it. You just to tell the story the way you tell it. You begin with a very nuts and bolts chapter on immigration, and you make the very basic point that all the most anti-immigrant figures in the 1960s, what has happened is on a scale beyond all their doomsday predictions. So that for British viewers and other European viewers and Commonwealth viewers will be familiar with the name of Enoch Powell, who was a prominent conservative and gave a famous speech which became known as the Rivers of Blood speech. And you point out in the beginning of your book that if you look at the boroughs in London, which are now majority non-white British, that's beyond anything Powell predicted.
No, if Powell in 1968 had decided to say that in 2011 the official census would show people who identified as white Britons to be in a minority in their capital city.
Right.
I mean, that would have caused. We think that the speech caused enough trouble as it was. That really, that would have got him, confined, I'd have thought.
But people would have thought that he was just nuts, that there's no way that can happen that quickly.
Yes, and as we all know, all the worst doomsayers were underestimating the situation. I mean, the other one is or one of the others I give is the example in France of this, I think, a ugly novel, Camp of the Saints, which has 1 million people landing on the shores of France, coming from the third world. And there's this interview I quote in the book where in 2011 the author of that novel that was published in 1973, thought to be absolutely explosive and so on, he's interviewed about the fact that quite a lot of what he said seems to have sort of happened. And at the end of the interview in 2011 on French television, the interviewer says, but you've got to admit, Jean Raspail, you've got to admit, the numbers never happen like that. And he says, no, that's true. I mean, we never actually had 1 million people come in one go. 2011.
Right.
Was. Even the most apocalyptic people,
and then Frau Merkel invites in whatever it is, 1.5 million to Germany, and you have and again, these are the major powers we're talking about here: Britain, France, Germany. But you just mentioned en passant at one point that the majority of Swedes alive now will live long enough to see them become a minority in their own country.
Yeah.
This is Sweden, which is kind of as far north as you can go in Europe. And it's also, I mean, it's interesting to me because with Britain, you know, the 1948 British Nationality Act made a quarter of the world's population British subjects. They did not distinguish in law between one of His Majesty's subjects from Kingston-on-Thames, Kingston, Ontario, Kingston, Jamaica. You can argue about whether that's a good idea, but it is a legal fact. Sweden is not anybody's idea of a great global empire. How do Swedes wind up becoming a minority in their own country?
It's a very interesting case, of Swedish one. There were things that I kept on thinking may not apply to certain countries. I thought maybe, I mean, the Swedes have got no reason to have post-colonial guilt.
No,
I mean, there's a good argument for Britain having it for a bit, you know, but the Swedes, and then and also then the other bits of the guilt, of course, which I think is one of the fundamental things in Europe that we're going to have to shake off, but may not. You know, the Swedes don't seem like, they're not like the Germans, you know, who have like good cause to have recent guilt complexes and so on, and forever, you know, needing to apologize for what they think and feel and do. The Swedes, you know, you wouldn't expect that. Actually, all of the same things exist. I mean, the Swedes do have a kind of weird post-colonial thing. They have a guilt thing as well. They've actually, strangely, the further away they come from the war, the more guilty they feel about it, it seems. So it's just more quietly expressed, but they're all symptoms of the same thing. It's just ever so slightly different inflections in each country. Sometimes one country's facts are different, but the response is exactly the same.
Yeah, there's an interesting phenomenon that goes on in Europe. When I first started writing about this, I guess, you know, shortly after 9/11, sophisticated people at think tanks and whatnot used to say, well, this is a completely banal reductio. Obviously, if you look at Pakistanis in Yorkshire, that's completely different from the experience of Algerians in Clichy-sous-Bois or Turks in Hamburg, or and in fact, none of it is. It's like you could toss, you know, the Turks could be in Yorkshire and the Pakistanis could be in Clichy-sous-Bois, and it all seems to come out the same.
Yes, I mean, well, that's one of the things that you've been on to longer than anyone. At any, you know, think tank, I mean, any public meeting, any political discussion, any television show, most of the time, you know, this one aside and a few others, but I mean, any, like, I don't know, BBC shows, you never get into the only thing that matters. It's you never get on to the important things. It's just time to sort of say, well, you know, there's a huge difference, isn't there, Douglas, between these people and that people. And you go, well, yeah, I mean, and then, well, thank you, and that's that. You don't get the chance to say, what about this huge thing that's happening? And I think there are all sorts of reasons for that. One is that we console ourselves through this period by pretending it's not going on. But as I say at one point in the book, you know, the presumption we've had is that the lie of more than a generation is if you walk into the Italian islands or the Greek islands or anywhere else, you walk up through Europe, you become as European as anyone else, and you breathe the air of Voltaire and St. Paul and Dante and Goethe and Bach. And that's nonsense. I think it's highly unlikely that everyone who arrives in Europe arrives at the same slightly pained, wounded and tired view that modern Europeans find themselves to be in. I think it's highly unlikely they'll have just arrived and happened to be at the stage we're in our views of religion, for instance.
No. You describe at one point you're in France and you visit the famous cathedral in which Charles Martel's remains are interred, the man who held the line against Islam in 732 and is celebrated, and that's why he's buried among the French kings. That's his stature. And yet you describe the scene around that cathedral, which is really quite remarkable. Aside from that Christian building in the middle of it, it's not Europe anymore.
No, and I say if Charles Martel got out of his tomb and wandered just outside the Basilica at Saint Denis, he would think he'd lost the Battle of Tours. It's a very strange and painful thing, this. The French, I think, are deeply pained by this. They don't know what to do about it. The centre of Paris, they all know this place is there. It's an extraordinary part of their history where the tombs of the kings all are. But they don't want to go there. And they wish it wasn't there. They wish it wasn't as it was. But it is.